Hey guys, and welcome to another tutorial video for the Animal Behavior Kit. In this video, we're actually going to look at how to use my Procedural Foliage Placement Tool as a way to spawn animals in your world in a random manner. And if you're wondering why I'm doing this tutorial, I actually got a message from a community member recently asking me if there was a good way of populating his world. He has a large open world with animals without having to manually align every single animal. And if you have a really big landscape with a lot of mountains, it can be quite time consuming to try to manually drag all of your animals and align them to the landscape. Um, so this tutorial is specifically for the users that actually own, obviously, my animal behavior kit as you see here, but also happen to own my procedural foliage placement tool. And the reason for that is because even though this is called procedural foliage placement, this tool also has the ability to spawn any blueprint actor class. So you can spawn pretty much anything, including obviously animals. Right. So if you happen to own both tools and you're making an open world game and you're trying to figure out a good way of populating your scene with animals, this tutorial is for you. And if I go here to the content, we're gonna take this in two stages. One is we're gonna look at some settings that we can optimize with the ABK animals to prepare them to be spawned in the open world. Things like changing some of the proximity settings and HUD settings. We're going to be making a very small change to that initial check, and I'm going to show you exactly why. And then we're finally going to use the procedural foliage tool, and I'm going to show you some of the settings that you need to use in that tool to make sure that the animals spawn correctly. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into Unreal. And again, if you have the procedural foliage placement tool, you're probably going to recognize this map. This is the showcase map. In this case, I've duplicated it and I've called it level animal spawn. And if I change my view to the top, you can see that it's a pretty big map. And what I've done is I've created my own spawner, and I've selected a smaller area of the map simply to make sure that we can actually play in this area. There's also a nav mesh component that you see that I've added right here, and if I press P, you can see that the nav mesh has been built all around this world, including the lower areas. I'm gonna disable it now. The lower areas, which are more of a coast, and all the way to the higher areas that are more snowy, so you can see here. So I specifically chose this area because it has the difference in height, as you can see here. Another reason I chose a smaller area is because the bigger the area, the longer it'll take to build the nav mesh. So I didn't want to sit here for 30-40 minutes as it was going to build the entire nav mesh. So obviously for your real project, you may want to select the entire landscape, hit build, and then go get a coffee. So if we go back to our little handy list here, the first thing we'll do is we're going to look at some of the proximity settings that we have here. So if you used the animal behavior kit before, you know that there's a system that checks for the player's proximity, and if the player is nearby, the animal will be enabled, but if the player is far, the animal will automatically disable itself, and that makes a big difference when it comes to performance. So we definitely want to make sure that we use the proximity system in a really big world such as this one. Otherwise, you're going to have potentially hundreds of animals that the player can't even see behind the mountain or whatever that are just eating up at your processing power. So what I've done here is I've created two animals, and these are just clones of the doe and the buck that you can see here, and I moved them to a special folder, and I have them right here. So if I open the female, all I've done is exactly what comes with ABK. I've taken out the additional systems like the need system, look for mate, things like that, just because we want to keep it simple. And I've made some changes here under the simulation. So you know that if you go under setup general, simulation details, we want to make sure that we definitely run on proximity. Again, this is for performance reasons. The radius to activate has been changed to 10,000, which is still a pretty big distance, and the check frequency has been increased to 20 seconds. So we're going to make that same change I'm going to open the male here, the buck. And again, if you click on the little icon on the little section here, you navigate all the way down to Setup General, go to Simulation Details. These are the defaults, and we're going to go ahead and change it. So radius to activate from 30,000, which is a massive trace. We're going to change that to something like 10,000. And you can play around with this number. The lower the number, the better, obviously. And the frequency, every 5 seconds is going to do this trace. We're going to increase that to about 20 seconds. And again, depending on your game, you should go ahead and play around with these settings. The other option is going to be in the HUD. Right now, it's going to simply show the HUD all the time. And the HUD in itself is constantly rotating towards the player, right? So that's a constant rotation of the HUD. So we have two options. We can either disable it completely, or the middle path would be to show HUD only on proximity, and this option right here. And that's also going to make sure that we have improved performance. Any animal that's really far, the player most likely doesn't even need to see the HUD. You can disable it, and then it will not rotate it, obviously, because it's not even being shown. When the player gets close to the animal, the HUD will show up and it'll start rotating. All right. And that's pretty much it. So we've done the proximity, and then we've made sure that we enable the HUD on proximity only. Now here's a little tricky part here, and I make this and I put this little checks here. There is a small change that I had to make sure that that the level starts smoother. So depending on which version of the project you have, right now the current version that is in the marketplace is 1.2.3. So if you see this video and you want to implement this change, I'm gonna share the information here. Otherwise, this is gonna be the default behavior for the upcoming update 1.3. But here's what's happening. If you have a lot of animals in your scene, hundreds of animals, as soon as you hit play, all of the animals are going to try at the very same time to do an initial trace for the player. And that happens in this blueprint here, BP BTS set AI state. And this is basically calling the event check player distance. And what's happening is that the editor in Unreal is detecting all those simultaneous requests as an infinite loop. It's basically saying there are way too many requests to try to loop through traces, and it actually stops the editor and says that there's an infinite loop detected. Two options: you can increase the infinite loop iteration, which I don't recommend, or you can do what I did, and it's a very simple thing, is that instead of calling it immediately, you just add a delay node for the initial check, and you add a random value between, in this case, 0 to 2 seconds. That is it, right? So if you go to the event graph and you search for event check player distance, this event is basically the timer that is going to check on the player frequency if there are players around. And we're simply adding a quick delay node with a random delay between 0 and 2 seconds. And the random delay is important because we want each individual animal to have a slightly different starting. And that's basically going to smooth out when all of these events start, and it's going to basically smooth out that in between the next 2 seconds. If you delay it by the same amount of time, then you still have the same problem because they're all going to request the player distance at the same time. Again, this is literally, that's all you need to do to fix that problem. If you have version 1.3 and above, you do not need to do this. This is going to come by default. All right. With all that said, that is all we need to do, guys. So we are going to now set up our animals in the tool. So if you click on the procedural placement tool here, I've already set them up, but I'm going to go through the settings. We want to make sure that we go to the actors list. These are going to be actors. And you open the first one, and you notice that there's going to be a field called actor with a priority parentheses. This is where you would set the actor class. And you can see here we have this actor class right here. And you can either click on the little drop down here and search for it, or even easier, you can select it from your content browser here, and you can click on the little arrow here, and it'll set it to that class. Remember, this can be anything, and right now we're going to spawn the animals. So that's the first thing. Then we want to have a max number of spawns. In this case, I'm gonna put about 200 for this area. You can do spawn details. In this case, I'm gonna leave it at random location. Let's keep it simple. The collision bounds here, I did not mess around with these settings. Ideally, you would go in and you would open the actual mesh, and you will get the bounds of the mesh, and you can enter the bounds of the mesh here. That would give you more accurate collision. Scale mode, you want to make sure that it's uniform, and in this case the uniform scale is 1:1. In other words, you do not want to modify the scale of your animal. This is useful for trees and things like that, foliage, but for your animal you do not want to do that. So make sure that you leave this uniform 1:1. In other words, nothing's going to happen. The next setting is the ground Z offset, and by default this is -10. In other words, when the trace hits the ground, it'll spawn the actor 10 units into the ground, and that makes sense if you're doing trees and foliage, because if there's a slope, you don't want it to be floating around. But in this case, we want to put a value of, in this case, 100. And how did I come up with this 100? Here's the trick. You open your animal, and this can go for any animal that you want, and you click on the mesh, and you'll see that the mesh is actually not at the center of the actor. The center of the actor will be the center of the sphere here, but there's an offset down to make sure that the feet are at the bottom. And the way you determine that offset is by going right here. You select your mesh and you look at the location, and in the case of the doe, the offset is -90, right? So the doe is actually -90 from the center of the actor. So to counter that, what I've done is I've added, instead of -90, we should have 90, and I've added a pattern of about 10. So it's going to hit, and it's going to choose the location as 100 units above the actual landscape. And those 100 units are going to be again offset by the -90, which means that it's going to be about 10 units from the ground. Okay, you can select random yaw, even though that doesn't really make a difference because the animals are obviously going to move around randomly. You do not want to have a line to surface. Okay, we don't want to rotate the animal. We want the animal to be perfectly straight. If you have IK for your animal, then that will take care of the alignment. So do not do this. And lastly, in this case, we're going to simply use the height range to spawn the animals. You can do height, or you can do physical material, for example. In this case, I chose that the doe is going to be between -10,000 all the way down to the coast to +10,000 height, which is about where this line is. And for the buck, I've chosen a slightly different, they all have the same settings, but as far as height, I've chosen to start at 5,000 all the way to 50,000. In other words, all the way as high as it can go. What that means is that all of the females are going to start about halfway here, and they can go all the way here. But the males are going to start all the way higher and go all the way here. And that's just the starting area, obviously. That's just the spawn. There's nothing preventing them from going all over the place afterwards. But that's just a way of showing you how you can spawn different animals. So if you have an animal, let's say an alligator or a turtle or whatever, that you want it to be close to the water, then you can use the height settings here to spawn them there, versus some animal like a polar bear that you would definitely want it to be high up here. And how do you determine these numbers here? Well, if you're using my material and you go into the material instance, you can look at the parameters section here, and you can see that the snow starts at height 10,000 and the sand starts at height -1,000. So you can use these values here to play around with the height range here, and you'll know that it works perfectly fine. All right, so enough talking. I think we have everything set up. Let me just go one last time. Keep scaling to 1. Do not align to surface. Avoid obstacles, and be conservative. The last one, avoid obstacles. Make sure that in your settings you either have the obstacle set up with the do not spawn tags here, in this case road and water, or if you want to be really short, you can select spawn only on ground. And what this means is that, and you can see here as I hover, that your landscape needs to have the tag PFT ground, right? And if we click on the landscape and we search for tag, notice that I have the tag PFT ground. If you do not have this tag, the animals will not spawn. As simple as that. It's basically only spawning on elements that have that tag. So that means that no trees, nothing, none of the water. And if you have obstacles or buildings or cars or whatever, it will automatically avoid all of those. All right, great. So let's go ahead and do an initial pass, and we're gonna go with the does first. So the initial actor index is 0 because we're going to spawn the females first. And we just click on spawn actors. And you'll notice that automatically we spawned 74 instances here. And you can see that they've spawned all around. They did not spawn in the water because that is not part of the landscape. And notice as well that they spawned as high as this line here because again we restricted the height to up to 10,000. And if you go into one of these guys here, notice that they look like they are correctly aligned and correctly on top of the landscape. Again, because we added that offset of 10 plus the minus 90 for that 100. Now we're going to go ahead and spawn the males, the bucks. So we changed the actor index to 1. Click on spawn actors. And notice now we spawn 55. Then now we have the males spawning all the way up here. And all the way as low as 5,000. So we have some males right here. All right. And that's pretty much it, guys. I'm going to go ahead and click Save All. And obviously you can spawn more animals. For the sake of the tutorial, I'm just going to keep it at, just 100 some animals here. But obviously you can spawn more animals in a bigger terrain. You go ahead and click play. And we're going to go ahead and expand here. And you can see that the animals around me are moving around automatically. All of those here. And if I eject and I go all the way here, let's search for another animal. Let's see if we can find another one. You can see that this guy right here, this doe, is disabled because again, she's too far away. That's the intended behavior. And if we go all the way up here, all of the males are pretty much disabled at this point because they're way too far from our player. That's exactly what we want. So we're saving quite a bit of performance because none of the animals that we're seeing are enabled. And you can see the frame rate here on my right hand side, close to 90 frames per second. And if I'm going to run all the way up here and let's go to the males here. And you can see that as soon as I get close, they start moving. Obviously, I have my sprint as a very, very high number. Normally in your game, you won't have this sprint, which means that as the player gets closer on a normal speed, you'll give enough time to the animals that are far to actually do the trace. So you can see that they just did the trace and started moving, and that's because they're doing it every 20 seconds. But again, in a normal game, you wouldn't sprint so quickly, right? This is almost like God mode, and this is why you're seeing that. All right, and that's pretty much it, guys. And notice also that the HUD is not showing unless we get really close. See that? And that means that again we're saving some performance. All right. Oh, last thing before I forget is the importance of the tags. ABK uses a specific tag called ABK player. So if you go to any of your classes and you go into this area here, into the simulation, you'll see, whoops, not here, but the simulation, you will see this area here. ABK no spawn, but also if you look into the set AI, the actual option, it's actually looking for players with the tag ABK player. So make sure that you go to your BP third person character, you click on BP third person here, search for tag, and add the tag ABK player, rather, as you see right here. Otherwise, they will not find you and they won't be moving. Right? So that's the last piece of the puzzle. Make sure that you have ABK underscore player, just like you see here, so the animals can actually find you. Alright guys, that is pretty much it. I would recommend that you, if you have a massive world, that you do these optimizations regardless if you need to spread your animals around. I would still advise you to use the animal spawner or the population control system. Those I would say are still preferred because that means that your population doesn't have to be present all the time. Or you can use a mix, which is I think the best approach. Spawn the initial number of animals here, and then use your population control to make sure that the animals are kept in check. Okay guys, hopefully this helped. Again, thank you so much for the user that made the suggestion. It just came as a question, but I figured, hey, this is a really interesting use case. So hopefully this helps you out. Again, this is specifically for my procedural foliage placement tool. If you have it and you have a massive world, hopefully this helps you out. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, or again, you can reach me at the Discord server, or you can email me directly. So, all right, thanks a lot, guys, and I will see you in the next video.